So good morning again. Wait, that's your turn. Come on. All right, there we go. I know it's the last Sunday of the year, and I know you've just had Christmas, and maybe your bellies are still full of turkey or prime rib or whatever it is you eat for Christmas, but I need you to hang there with me, right, this morning. My name is Heather Blair, and I'm the associate pastor here at First United Methodist Church, and we welcome you. We're so glad to have you here with us this morning. Today, we're at the edge of a time for fresh starts, a time of wiping the slate clean. We have a new calendar, a season to renew our resolve to do things better, maybe to bring some order to our chaos or to put an end to a destructive habit. The new year is a time for us individually to make fresh starts. Sometimes it can be hard to decide what you want to do, but I think that might be a little bit the delight of children who do not need as many fresh starts as adults do, as much trouble as they may make. I think they don't need fresh starts as much as we do. And so often we take time at the beginning of a new year to make some promises to ourselves about how we might live differently. It's a good time to do that. But it's also a good time for us to do that as a church family. What things might First United Methodist Church do differently in 2015? And some of you are maybe visitors here this morning with us, and so maybe you need to fill in that blank with a different church home name. But I mean it for the church at large as much as I mean it for our church specifically. What might we do to help you be more excited to be here? What might we do to help other people be more excited to be here? What might we all do together to bring more love and joy and glory to God? Let me give you a second with those questions maybe. What might we do differently in 2015? How might we be different? Do you have some ideas? You don't have to shout them out. Don't worry, we're not going to go there this morning. But I have some ideas, I think. Now, I don't want to rain on our parade, just as I get you all excited about a fresh start, but let's acknowledge a little something right up front, because the vast majority of us have made resolutions before, and what happens to a large part of those resolutions? This part you can shout out. Yeah, January 3rd happens. There you go. They don't come to pass often. Some of them do, and I admire you if you've made that happen, but I fall a little bit more into that category of January, I'm going strong. February, I have a couple little falls, but I'm hanging in there. And then by March, I've abandoned all pretense of keeping my New Year's resolutions. If you're on the 1, 2, 3 days of January track, then you might be a little faster than me. We mess things up or we get busy and forget or whatever, but so many of those fresh start improvement ideas fall by the wayside. It happens to us as individuals, and it happens to us when we're trying to work together as a group, maybe even more. So many of the wishes we make about church are things we wish other people would do. Or even if we're willing to help, we can't find other people to come alongside us, and the thing that we want to do can't be done all by ourselves. Or someone tells us that there aren't enough resources, or someone in charge doesn't like our plan, so our new efforts kind of peter out. We get tired and discouraged and distant. I listen to a lot of you talk about church. I listen to a lot of people in general talk about church. And I would say that there's a large swath of you in our congregation, but also just a large swath of people in Christianity who see this church, the church, as in trouble, on a potential downhill decline. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but I understand that my perspective is limited. Lots of people have written off the church, especially the mainline churches. They think that we are irrelevant. They think especially that we're out of touch with youth culture, and I'm not sure I can deny that. I'm not sure that, I can't deny that we have fewer people on a Sunday that we may wish that we do. And I can't deny that the average age of our congregation isn't climbing a little, maybe over the last few years. We do have some real challenges as a church body here specifically and as the church at large. But how do we respond? That's the critical question. Do we circle our wagons and hang on as long as possible, hoping that we'll survive somehow, or at least die quietly without much fanfare, or that maybe there'll be divine intervention? We hoard our resources because we think that we're in a time of shortage, and we look forward and think that time will be even more short in the future. Do we maybe give up and walk away because we're bored with church, or disillusioned with church, or angry, or tired of trying again and again? And I think all of us who actually showed up here a few days after Christmas want the answers to those questions to be no. No, we don't want to give up and walk away. No, we don't want to circle our wagons and become insular. But how can we find the resolve at the beginning of a new year? How can we find the resolve to make sure that we will hold on? How can we find the strength to stay open and hopeful and faithful and generous in the face of some big obstacles? This morning, I want to share the story of a man who spent his life working to start a church. And he faced some pretty steep obstacles too. So I'm hoping that as we look at his story, maybe we can find some inspiration, find some strength for us at the cusp of 2015. His whole life story is kind of long, so don't worry, I'm not going to try to tell the whole thing today. But it's probably a familiar story, and if you were guessing about the guy I was going to talk to you about this morning who planted a church, you might guess that his name is Jesus. The part of story that Jesus' story that we're going to spend time in this morning is recorded in Mark's Gospel, and it's from his account actually of Jesus' last days on earth. Jesus spent a lot of time working to build the church with his first group of disciples, planting in them the legacy of what would follow after him. We're going to pick up midway into chapter 14, and I'm going to read some scripture at different points, but don't feel the need to stand, and we won't read it all in one section. So Jesus has had his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. When we pick up the story, he's had that moment that we celebrate on Palm Sunday where everyone is cheering him and thinking he's spectacular, even if he knows they don't quite mean it. And then he takes some time out to do some critical last-minute teaching with those close to him. Jesus gets anointed by the woman who loves much. And all these things seem pretty lovely right up until the time that Mark's account takes a little bit of a turn for the ominous. And if we had a soundtrack for that portion, it might sound a little something like, dun, dun, dun. Because, oh, thank you. Because suddenly the enemies of Jesus get a lot louder and more threatening. Things are so tense in Jerusalem that when the disciples go to find a place for them to celebrate the Passover meal, they have to do it in secret. They have to develop sort of signs and signals to find a place. There are hushed entries. And even though all the arrangements do get made and the meal is laid out, there's kind of a cloud hanging over the occasion. It's supposed to be a night to celebrate freedom. That's what Passover's about, freedom from slavery, the deliverance of Israel. But Jesus and the disciples are hidden away in an upper room, perhaps afraid to laugh or talk too loud, reminding each other to speak kind of in hushed tones so they won't draw too much attention. As the night progresses, maybe the tension eases a little bit because they're eating, and Mark says that they've been able to recline while they eat, which is their custom. And so suddenly, as the tension has maybe eased a little bit, Jesus says this: "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me." Can you imagine that moment with me for a minute? Can we try to put ourselves in that story? We outnumber the disciples this morning, and yet I'm going to ask you to stretch your imagination and pretend that it's us gathered in that upper room, and we have entered Jerusalem under these tense circumstances. We're so close to Jesus' most powerful and dangerous enemies, and yet here we are, his chosen few, his closest friends, and also the beginning of his church. We've seen him in action for 3 years. We know what he can do some of us at least, know who he is. We believe we're ready to defend him at any cost. How could any group be any closer? But Jesus says that one of us will betray him. It is one of the 12, says Jesus, one who dips bread into the bowl with me. Surely you don't mean me, we all say in turn, looking at each other. But one of us is a liar. And suddenly the fears that were out there have crashed in here. Our safe place. The enemy has crashed into the center of our table, and he shattered our night into 1,000 pieces. He shattered our community, our church, our baby church. We were an us, but now we're a bunch of me's. Surely you don't mean me. And hasn't that sort of thing happened to us here in the present? Discontent with this church or the church. It's rampant. In the week before Christmas alone on Facebook, I saw 5 kind of viral articles about why I'm leaving the church or why I have left the church. And I admit that everyone, even if I read it and try to stay open and compassionate, every one of them strikes a little bit of fear in me and also some defensiveness and anger. We know that people have left and are leaving. We know that there aren't hordes of people coming in. We're kind of unsettled by that. And sometimes we start to pointing fingers all over the place, trying to figure out who the guilty party is. We were an us, but we can quickly become a bunch of me's, and surely this isn't my fault. Hang on, though. Let's get back to the story, because this is the very table that's set, this table of somewhat discontent and disquiet, this table of us being fractured apart and not quite perfect. This is the table that's set when Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." So here it is in Mark, the first communion meal, the beginning, the one Jesus himself actually attended, the one we're emulating each time we share the Lord's Supper. The central sacrament of our faith begins here. One of the most identifying activities of our church starts here. But let's don't miss this. From the very beginning, it was never a perfect occasion. The disciples weren't all holy and perfect. They weren't even unified, really. They're not completely broken yet, but the cracks are beginning to show. This wasn't a meal celebrating the pinnacle of community, as if we have arrived at the summit, the purest form of Jesus-centered community. It wasn't like that. It wasn't an awards banquet, and the reward was the opportunity to share in the life of Christ. It wasn't an awards banquet, it was an intervention. And every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper, it's not an awards banquet, it's an intervention. An intervention because they were in crisis, an intervention because we are from time to time in crisis, a crisis of community, a crisis of the church, an intervention because they were fractured, not united. It was an intervention of grace. There has never in the history of ever been a perfect communion meal because they have always involved people. That the moment in the Bible that is maybe most associated with togetherness, with communion, is actually fraught with brokenness, with community interrupted. It's heartbreaking, but Jesus' response is so beautiful and completely unreasonable. He knows that his disciples are not together, and he knows that it's going to get worse, but he sticks with them. He never abandons his plans to make these people into his church. While they're still sinners, while they're screw-ups for real and not just for pretend, they're selfish and isolated, and there's only evidence that they can't live up to it, but Jesus extends them an offer of a new covenant, a new promise for togetherness with God and with each other. He gives them a chance to not go down the paths where they've started to scatter, even though he knows they won't be able to embrace it yet. So let's continue in the story. After dinner, our group, let's still say, heads up to the Mount of Olives to camp out for the night. So we've heard that one of us is going to betray Jesus, and that sort of put a damper on the evening. But then we've had this incredible outpouring of grace, this offer of a new covenant, nothing more or less than a connection with God. So maybe we're trying to rebound, and okay, we say one of us is going to do something really awful, but it's not me, and maybe the rest of us can pull together and fight it off. And into that moment, Jesus says, you will all fall away. And now the air really goes out of our lungs. Jesus thinks we're all failures, not just one of us. It can't be true, though, Jesus. You're not being fair. I am committed. Or as Peter says, even if all fall away, I will not. The cracks that were hinted at dinner now become huge grand canyons of separation between people. Forget these others, Lord. I will not fail you. I will be your champion. Even if I have to die, says Peter, I will never disown you. And then all the others said the same. Each of us may be so sure of themselves and also so sure that all the others are the weak ones. I am the strong one, God. I will endure. I and my strength will be here for you. I alone will be what you want. But do you hear the tragedy in that moment? I alone can never be what Jesus wants. Even though Jesus loves me personally as a single solitary human being, if I watch while all the others fall away and somehow do remain standing, I mean, I'm not going to, but if I could, I've still missed the point entirely. Jesus isn't about collecting self-made, strong individuals who pass all his tests, who make it through the gauntlet and get up to his high holy hill. Jesus is about unifying a bunch of misfits, bringing together and sticking together people in such a way that everyone knows that something supernatural has happened. And it has to be something supernatural at work, because there's no way we could hang together on our own. There's no way we can hang together on our own, church. But Jesus sees the possibility in us today, and them then. Even in the midst of repeated failure, he sees the possibility and he fights for it. You will all fall away, and he's right. They do, they will. They already have as soon as they abandoned each other. So what does Jesus do? Does he pull back? Does he yell? Does he whine? Does he cut them off? Does he quit? No. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, mighty Peter, James and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." He's told the disciples that they'll all fall away. So what does he do here? On the surface, it might look like he abandons them because he goes up by himself to pray for a while. But once you hear what he prays, you know that he hasn't abandoned them at all. We have to go to the book of John to find the fuller version of Jesus' prayer in the garden. The prayer that happens in the midst of his greatest agony, in the midst of his betrayal by those closest to him, and on the eve of his death. This is what he asks. "Holy Father, protect them by the power of your name, the name you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one, I and them and you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me." With his last breaths, he's still fighting for togetherness, for a church, for God's gathered people. He went up on the hill alone to ask that the disciples might be able to come together. And now at the time where his doubts about people must have been the greatest. Because right before this prayer, he does ask a few select disciples for one last thing. One last thing. And here it is. Maybe I've been setting the bar too high, he says. Here's the one thing I'm going to ask you. Just stay awake. Just stay awake. Keep your eyes open. It's pretty simple. And they still blow it. These are our founding fathers in action. So if somebody tries to tell you that it's the pristine people who do church, we all know better. And we can't afford to forget it. It is not pristine people who do church. It's people who are as mistaken and maybe even more mistaken as anyone else that we'll meet. All these times, his church kind of startup team has let him down. They failed him. And he still prays a prayer of faith that they'll become one. They're not even done failing him. They'll all abandon him as he goes to the cross. They will all fall away. And yet he still believes in them. He hopes for them. He prays for them. Help them to be one as you and I are one God, he says. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you've loved me. And then guess what? That happened. The disciples fell away. They abandoned Jesus. He died alone with his church in fragments, looking utterly hopeless. And I know that's how a lot of people see the church today, too. Hopeless, dying in fragments. And there's no denying that we've lost our edge in the world. Church attendance isn't a given. Our rhetoric and our alleged moral purity aren't compelling to people. But this thing that Jesus offers, this real togetherness, has always been compelling. The disciples eventually did rebound. The things that Jesus hoped and prayed for them came to pass. They came back together after having scattered at the critical moment. And their brand of loving each other, even as failures, their brand of loving each other caught the attention of the whole world. It drew people into community. The church was established by this gang of mess-ups, and we're here because of them, because they loved people who loved people who loved people who loved me, who loved you, and somehow we all ended up here in this room together today because of this band of misfits and screw-ups, these people who are fractured and facing the biggest obstacles that we can imagine themselves. They didn't give up. They didn't give up because Jesus didn't give up. And he's not giving up on us either. We have the potential to love like that. We have the potential to love each other like that, and we have the potential to love people outside of this building like that. I don't care what numbers and trends say. Jesus says, I will build my church. I will build my church, and the gates of hell, even the gates of hell, won't prevail against it. Does that mean that this church specifically will survive? Not necessarily. But it sure means that it can. It sure means that it can if what we resolve to do is be God's church. Whether you're a normal part of us or whether you're going to be a part of God's church in some other place. Whether you came this morning and you've been coming faithfully for 50 years, we need you to promise. Whether you're listening to this message in a few weeks because you're homebound, we need you to be resolved to be part of us. Whether you are just considering and you decide you don't like it here and you want to go somewhere else, we still need you to be part of us. We need to be together. We have the potential to fight for togetherness and to love the world the way that God meant for us to love it. It means that we have the chance to survive, and not just survive, to thrive, to live. We've got to be resolved to be together, though. We've got to start talking to each other, some real talk maybe, about how things really are with us. Showing up in the same place isn't being together. I mean, it's a good first step. It's kind of a critical step at some point, but it doesn't end there. It's being involved in each other's lives. It's talking to each other about how we do church and why we do church and what we want to do differently as a church. And that has more to do with you guys than it has to do with me or Pastor Rick. This is your church, and we just serve here. We've got to start listening to the people who are outside of our church, really listening to them about why they're outside. And even if we don't think it's a good reason, because look, whether you're here or whether you go home, you're still part of the church. You can't quit the church. You can quit coming here, but you can't quit the church. You're still part of God's kingdom, and you'll still be just as culpable as me, even if I stay here for the rest of my life. But we do better if we get together, if we're all here and we show up in the same place and we work together. That's when we get compelling. So we've got to start listening to the people who aren't here and have real compassion for the reasons that they aren't here. We've got to help them see where they might fit among us, and we've got to make room for them to fit among us. We've got to make room for each other to fit among us. We've got to confront maybe some long-standing bad habits, some long-standing failures, and just admit that they have been. We've got to challenge our apathy, maybe our disillusionment with the church. We've got to forgive each other. We've got to forgive ourselves for our failures. There are a lot of obstacles to togetherness. Yes, Jesus says in these stories that we've just read about him, yes, I hear you. It's hard. And yet, keep fighting to stick together. Take advantage of every fresh start. Don't get cynical about a new year. Don't get cynical about a new day. Don't get cynical about a new effort in the church or a new resolve on your own part. Be daring. Keep fighting. Fighting for togetherness is never in vain. There are lots of ways we're already together. We're literally together in this room. We're not at square one. I'm not saying that. Our church is full of breathtaking people, but it could be fuller of breathtaking people. There are loads more breathtaking people out there who need a place in God's gathered people. But it's going to take all of us coming together to reach them. It's going to take all of us coming together to realize our potential, That is to make real what's possible in us because of God. What might First United Methodist Church do in 2015? What might the large Church of God do in 2015? I'm not sure. Let's get together and ask God, and then let's get to work and find out.